Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today we're going to the Shenandoah Valley, where an impending sense of victory swept over Union forces assembled in the valley on the outskirts of the hamlet of Kernstown on Sunday morning, March 23rd, 1862. Stonewall Jackson and his rebels would be whipped in their home turf in Virginia, and the war would soon be over, was the prevailing thought. A few miles away in Winchester, more Federals marched through town on their way to battle. Private Henry Comey, pictured here, watched from the sidelines. He and his regiment, the 2nd Massachusetts Infantry, were held in reserve and would not fight. But Comey wasn't about to stay still. He said later on after the war, I would probably never see any action if we remained in reserve in Winchester. Strongly desiring to see what the war was all about, I picked up my rifle, bayonet, and cartridge box and went out through the garden of the house where we were quartered. When I reached the garden fence, I climbed over it and into the next yard and out to the street without being seen from headquarters. By this time, Comey could hear the cannon fire in the distance, and he followed the sound of battle. He later wrote, I ran for about 3 miles because I wanted to reach the battle before it ended. As I approached the battlefront, I went up to higher ground to get a view of the artillery batteries on both sides. As I watched, crouched down beside a large oak, I suddenly observed a rebel officer on horseback with his staff following. I could only guess who this might be. Though we never found out for sure, Comey believed the officer to be none other than Stonewall Jackson himself. The fiery Southern general was determined to prevent Union forces from leaving the Shenandoah Valley to reinforce Major General George B. McClellan and his Army of the Potomac, who were on a campaign to capture Richmond by way of the Virginia Peninsula on the other side of the state. The fervently religious Jackson, despite misgivings about fighting on the Sabbath, had gone to Kernstown with about 4,200 soldiers to engage the 9,000-man Union Army of Brigadier General James Shields, an Irish-born politician who had once challenged Abraham Lincoln to a duel when both men had served in the Illinois state government. Comey looked on as the Union batteries stopped firing and withdrew into a wooded area where thousands of Federals waited for the order to advance. He wrote, Then I saw the Union infantry move out of the woods and hasten to meet Stonewall Jackson's army. The 5th Ohio was the nearest regiment to my location. Comey continued his narrative. The order was given to the whole line to storm the rebels on high ground. This was my opportunity. I ran up to the sergeant on the left of the line and shouted, Do you want any recruits? Yes, said the sergeant. Fix your bayonet and get over there. He obeyed the order and joined the Buckeye State Volunteers. As our line advanced towards the rebels, I saw one Ohio soldier's head shot off by the enemy cannon fire. This is Comey writing. Ball, canister, and grape shot took a terrible toll on the Union men, he remembered. Smoke from the cannons was so heavy that we could hardly see which way to go. We eventually came to where we could see a limestone ledge and a stone fence. Behind the ledge and along the line of the stone fence were thousands of men with slouched hats and rifles. As we approached, we were peppered by volley after volley of rifle fire from those rebel infantrymen. Comey and the other Union soldiers took cover and continued the fight. Comey wrote, the sergeant who I'd reported to, but do not know his name, went down with several wounds, but we hung to the line until the rebels backed away. We would crawl up and fire, go back, reload, and crawl up again. Braver men could never be found, and I was proud to be among them during the deadly conflict. The Union Army emerged victorious, leaving Stonewall Jackson and his men with a rare defeat. The scenes of death and dying at Kernstown shocked Comey to his core. It was the worst sight I've ever seen in my life, and I would not forget it as long as I live, he wrote. Now I knew what war was like, but I will never be able to find the words to describe it. One eyewitness who surveyed the aftermath at Kernstown did find the words in an account by an unidentified source published in an Ohio newspaper. That writer wrote, "The ghastly aspect of the field yesterday, after the wound were removed and before the dead were interred, was appalling. Some with their faces off, some with their heads off, some torn into fragments and frightfully mangled by the round shot and shell, and others simply but effectually killed by bullet wounds." Comey ran back to his regiment in Winchester, where many of the 590 Union casualties from Kernstown were transported for medical treatment. His captain, Comey's captain, apparently unaware of his actions, sent him to residences in town to find cloth for bandages to bind the wounds of the injured. Comey wrote, "I had learned a hard lesson of loyalty, courage, and valor, which I would never forget. I had also learned about violent death and dying, and I knew that I would be forever changed in some way by that experience." Comey was, in fact, descended from a long line of men who had faced the harsh realities of war. One of his ancestors, David McComey, was a soldier in Scotland who participated in a 1651 invasion of England. Captured by soldiers from Oliver Cromwell's army, McComey was sent to British Massachusetts as an indentured servant. He eventually gained his freedom, married, and started a family. Over time, the surname changed to Comey. 5 family members who fought under the flag of the United Colonies in the Revolution. 19 descendants, including Comey, later defended the Union during the Civil War. Comey had enlisted in the 2nd Massachusetts Infantry in May 1861. Although uneducated in the art of war, he had graduated from Phillips Exeter Academy, where one of his classmates was Robert Todd Lincoln, the eldest son of the president. No evidence exists that the abolition of slavery motivated Comey to join the army. An incident that occurred a few months after he enlisted, however, indicated his position on the subject. In the summer of 1861, at Harper's Ferry, where he and his regiment were briefly stationed, a group of Southern men demanded the return of their slaves who had run away and followed the Union Army en route to Harper's Ferry. The general in command cited federal law and returned the fugitive slaves to their owners. Comey noted, "The law considered them property, and we had no choice but to obey the law. I was upset about this because I believe no human should be owned by another." Less than a year later, Comey stole away from his regiment to fight at Kernstown. He went on with his own regiment to participate in more battles. Although he managed to escape unscathed from a number of battles in Kernstown, he did suffer an injury in May 1863 after a fragment of a bullet struck him in the throat during the Battle of Chancellorsville. 2 months later, on July 3rd, he and almost half of his comrades in the 2nd Massachusetts became casualties after an ill-fated charge at Spangler's Meadow during the 3rd and final day at the Battle of Gettysburg. He wrote, "I was one of the wounded catching some buckshot and then a ball in the arm." Comey returned to Massachusetts to recuperate and checked in with an army doctor in Boston. "I was told," Comey recalled, "that my wounds were severe enough to warrant a discharge. But, as it did at Kernstown, the draw of war proved too strong." He wrote, "It would have been very uncomfortable to be able to stay at home with my loved ones and friends," he said, "but I did not want to do it. As long as the 2nd Massachusetts needed me, I must be there." Comey returned to his regiment and received an officer's commission, and he's pictured here wearing the shoulder strap of an officer. He suffered one more wartime injury not on the battlefield, but on a makeshift baseball field in Alabama. In April 1864, during a game in camp near Tullahoma, Comey attempted to steal a base. One of his fellow officers threw a ball at Comey in an effort to get him out. Comey fractured his ankle while attempting to dodge it. His recovery was frustratingly slow. In the fall of 1864, when the 2nd participated in Major General William T. Sherman's campaign to take Savannah, Comey went, but he traveled by horse while the regiment marched. Literally, he had a ride to the sea. By this time, Comey and his comrades mustered out of the army. That was in July 1865. The regiment had shrunk to the size of a company due to losses from fighting and disease. Colonel William F. Fox, in his treatise, Regimental Losses in the American Civil War, listed the 2nd Massachusetts as one of the 300 fighting regiments in the Union Army that saw the most action, inferred partly by its high casualty rate. Comey believed it was all worth it. He wrote, "We reflected on the fact that too many good men in blue and gray have died, including our beloved commander-in-chief. Then we realized that our mission had been accomplished, our Union had been preserved, and the former slaves are now free people. The war was over, and after 4 years of great sacrifice and valor, the healing must begin." Comey settled into a life of a salesman in Massachusetts. He married in 1866 and became the father of 2 daughters. Active in Veterans Affairs, he held a number of leadership positions in the Grand Army of the Republic. In 1928, Comey was named to a commission formed to establish the Petersburg National Battlefield. Its chairman was Carter R. Bishop, a cadet at the Virginia Military Institute, who was detailed to serve in the defenses of Richmond at the end of the war. On April 9th, 1932, the 67th anniversary of the surrender of the Army of the Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse, the 93-year-old Comey and the 83-year-old Bishop met Herbert Hoover at the White House. The pair of veterans invited the president to join them at the dedication of the Petersburg National Military Park, scheduled for June 20th. But it wasn't to happen. Comey died of pneumonia 6 days later. So there you have the story of Henry Comey, 2nd Massachusetts Infantry, and his adventures, his awareness, his first awareness of how brutal combat was at Kernstown in 1862. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.